The second slogan was the tricky one, the joke. It was Uncle Ho's empty suit turned inside out, a sartorial sensation that only a man of two minds or a man with no face dare to wear. This odd suit suited me, for it was of a cutting-edge cut. Wearing this inside-out suit, my seams exposed in an unseemly way, I understood at last how our revolution had gone from being the vanguard of political change to the rearguard hoarding power.
But now I'm worried what's going to happen.
Well, there's an enormous heron that in my campsite where I'm staying right now is filled with California ground squirrel burrows. And the heron's been walking around at night. And I'm like, what is it, hunting insects? And by God, I have now seen it spear with its razor-like beak and then swallow whole 2 medium-sized California ground squirrels.
Oh my God.
Did you know that herons ate rodents?
I did not know that. I mean, I guess it makes sense. Like a heron is just sort of like, I mean, it's just another pterodactyl.
Just a mini dinosaur, yeah. Yeah, and I mean, yes, they're good at wading, but why not wade through tall grass, And before they strike, too, I don't know if you've ever seen this, but they kind of move their head like a snake. They'll sort of,
I could see that,
they kind of bob and weave a little bit and then bam. And it definitely like speared it with the beak and then had to kind of like head bang to get it sort of off and then gum it down, which was just incredible to see.
Yeah, that's amazing. Be careful of things that are liable to like lock you in a room and torture you like unrelentingly for.
Well, apparently the heron is also a fan of wood pigeon, more or less.
Yeah, exactly.
Basically, herons take whatever kind of protein they can get, apparently. I have to say, it was incredibly impressive. The Sympathizer, Part 2.
Part 2, yeah. Going chapter 13 to the end, I think, right?
Yeah.
So our narrator gets back from his advisory role on The Hamlet, and also from his time in the hospital in the Philippines after being perhaps blown up by the auteur. And the first thing that he discovers is that he goes to visit his girlfriend, Miss Mori, to learn that Sunny Du, the also Vietnamese, very leftist newspaper reporter, has struck up a relationship with Miss Mori, a much firmer relationship than the relationship that Miss Mori deigned to have with our narrator, which is sad for him for sure.
But probably good for Miss Nori, since I don't know that our narrator was all that committed to, well, and ultimately not so good for Miss Nori, because so our narrator falls back in with the general, who is kind of raising money. There's this amazing scene in what's called a country club, but it's really just a fancy restaurant with a room for prostitutes. And that's the country club. And I forget the name. There's this British-American sort of windbag of a writer, kind of Kissinger type, named Head.
Richard Head.
Richard Head. Richard Head, indeed. Quite. I didn't even catch the joke until right now. I thought, Head, it must be that he's quite cerebral, but I see, in fact,
yes,
he's a bit of a D-head.
Yeah. When your last name is Bag and you have an uncle named Richard, these jokes, I mean, they're just everywhere.
Yeah.
And you're like, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, not the best choice there, Grandma and Granddad, but it's a family name apparently with the Bags, Richard.
and this is our great Uncle Douche. It's pronounced douche.
Yeah. It's from the the Louisiana branch of the Bags.
Yeah. All right. So, I mean, very entertaining scene at the country club. Maybe not so consequential, but fun to read. And then the general very, very circumspectly, without ever saying it directly, indicates that he wants the narrator to kill Sonny, who he resents for kind of writing a reported essay suggesting, why are these guys, why don't they just give up? Why are they trying to raise money and fight this war? The war is over. We should try to reconcile. The narrator reluctantly agrees and gets some help from his friend. Bon gets a gun, goes in, and then there's has this moment where Sonny is trying to do the decent thing and kind of acknowledge the kind of love triangle between the three of them, and they're basically making him much harder to kill because he becomes increasingly sympathetic to our sympathizing narrator. But the narrator does, in fact, kill Sonny, and now he has 2 murders on his conscience.
Yeah, he really bottles the job. He has to shoot him 6 times, I think, is what the eventual count is. And he even confesses to Sonny before he does it. Yeah. He comes clean. And Sonny, of course, doesn't believe him,
right?
Which is the terrible plight of our narrator, of any person who lives 2 lives, is that eventually nobody believes either of them.
Right. There's a sort of constant crying wolf quality.
Which will come back to haunt our poor narrator in the closing pages of this book.
Sure.
But the narrator tells his handler, Man, that he is going to return to Vietnam with Bon and this small expeditionary force, mostly because he really wants to try to keep Bon alive. He feels like that if Bon goes, he's going to end up dead. Bon is committed to that. Bon has basically been ready to die since the beginning of the book. And the narrator very much does not want that to happen.
Right.
But they return, going to Thailand first. Claude tries to, our old CIA spook Claude makes a reappearance and tries to take Bon and the narrator to a brothel. Bon and the narrator refuse, and they end up going to watch The Hamlet, the film that the auteur directed. Doesn't quite seem right timeline-ish. Like, it
probably would have taken a little longer to come out. Well, we don't quite know how much time passed either, because there was the whole Richard Head Country Club incident. So I don't know how well it's tracking, but it does seem like the movie came out awfully quickly.
Yeah, like Apocalypse Now probably took like several years in post-production, I'm guessing, to get it out. But, whatevs. The narrator is quite angry that he doesn't end up getting any kind of credit in the film. And the narrator and Bon and this squad of other Vietnamese, a bunch of continuing our structure of unnamed characters, an affectless lieutenant, a grizzled major, a dark marine, a darker marine, and the darkest marine. There's just this like hilarious dramatis personae of epithets.
Right.
And quickly
and a poor Lao farmer, right? Like who's kind of shanghaied into guiding them. It goes badly. The lieutenant steps on a landmine and his leg is blown off. And not long after that, they are ambushed and captured. And we finally get back to the setting that we started at. We are in the prison camp where our narrator is writing his confession and meeting regularly with the commandant to refine that confession. And I will kick it back over to you to take us in. The commandant is not impressed by our narrator's literary skills or his self-critical nature, his ability to see things from both sides. The commandant really is looking for kind of sincere repetition of revolutionary ideology without a lot of creativity attached to it. And he's not getting it. We kind of learn that there's a commandant.
Commissar.
Sorry, a commissar. There's the commandant and the commissar, right? And we kind of get the sense that the commissar is hopeful that our narrator will succeed in writing his confession. And, even the commandant acknowledges, you're not doing a very good job at this confession, but you're on the right side. We recognize that you were spying for our side. And so you're not really a prisoner, you're a guest, but you can't leave. But hey, we're not torturing you and yet. And so the confession, though, that he has written, which is basically the novel up to this point, isn't enough for the commandant. Right. And so the commissar starts torturing him through various means, most notably sleep deprivation. And we learn that the commissar is his old friend, Man. And Man has been horribly injured in a napalm attack. Man's doing the torture not because he wants to hurt the narrator, but because he feels like he has to project to the commandant that the narrator has really been re-educated. And so he's kind of going through the motions. And at one point he tells the narrator, there's something that you keep forgetting to confess to. And finally the narrator, I don't know if he suppressed this memory or he just doesn't want to think about it, but he finally tells the full story of this one communist agent who he's alluded to a few times, a woman who he was unable to help, who was tortured and beaten and then eventually raped by three South Vietnamese policemen in a really, really horrible way. And he has to admit that he did nothing to help her, and then he thinks he's done confessing, but he's not, because the narrator then says, well, you still have to answer the question of what is better than independence and freedom. I'll give it back to you.
Yeah. And the narrator finally responds to this question of what is better than independence and freedom, and it just gets asked and asked and asked. And I've really been thinking a lot about this question of like the difference of nothing and something.
Yeah.
And I believe the answer he finally gives is that nothing is better than independence and freedom.
He actually gives that right off the bat, and it's the wrong answer.
It's the wrong answer.
But then he then says nothing is greater than independence and freedom is the wrong answer, but nothing is greater than independence, or nothing is greater than independence and freedom is the correct answer.
Yeah.
It is purposefully puzzling.
Yes.
But the narrator explains to us that there are two different senses of the word nothing, and only a man like him with two minds, or a man like Man, with no face can understand the difference between nothing and nothing.
Right. And let's see. Man asks the narrator to kill him. Man realizes that he's in a pretty bad spot too. The narrator doesn't. The man realizes that this is an impossible request because the narrator will be killed, Bond will be killed. So he sort of exceeds and tells the narrator that he is going to get the narrator and Bond out of the country by purchasing their escape, by bribing the right people. And the book closes with the narrator and Bond on a boat, becoming boat people, getting ready for whatever is going to happen next. And there is another book called The Confessed. So maybe we would follow this character further into the future. I don't know if I want to spend more time with him, but I'm definitely intrigued by him.
It's a slightly hopeful note. It's like, they beat on boats to the current, borne ceaselessly into the unknowable future.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, the end of the book is that it says something about that we will live.
Yeah. Well, at least until we die.
Yeah.
It's an incredibly poetic. It does channel Gatsby, I think. But there's this
this book
but
channels
also like Whitman,
so many places, so many things. This is a dense book.
He switches to the first person plural for the last few paragraphs. And one sense is he's both referring to his kind of divided personality, but also a more broad we, perhaps meaning all of the refugees or boat people, perhaps meaning him and Bond, perhaps meaning all of us. Born ceaselessly into the unknowing future. It's a lovely ending, I thought. Actually,
it's a beautiful. I mean, like it's there are so many moments of like writing that just like makes you want to put the book down and go for a long walk in the snow.
Yeah, it's funny because I have a few questions, but mostly I have a couple of readings prepared, and I almost feel like this episode could just be reading stuff and reacting to it. That said, I will ask you one of my kind of craft questions, which is, after he kills Sonny, I found myself really hoping he would not do that. And when he did do it, there was some part of me that was like, I just don't like this. I kind of felt like this guy's irony and detachment. I understand the crapulent major was one thing, but we know he feels guilty about that. I kind of thought he was going to learn his lesson. And I was disappointed in him morally. And I found myself kind of a little bit detached from caring about what happened to him for that reason. He became increasingly unlikable for a while, although I will say the final 2 or 3 chapters after the confession about the rape, not that he does a rape, but he doesn't intervene, and after his being for the weird digression around the difference between nothing and something and all of that, I came round again. But there was a time when I was feeling a little bit uninvested, and I just wanted to ask, like, how do you think, when does an anti-hero just become a villain?
Yeah. This is like when House of Cards came out. House of Cards comes out in this really interesting period in our relationship with all of this stuff.
Yeah.
With anti-heroes, with streaming.
Right.
Like House of Cards was really the first we can just like sit down and binge out, an entire season of House of Cards.
And it was the first one made by a streaming company, as opposed to the streaming company puts a production made by somebody else on its service. I think
so it's like it was the first time that you could see novel things on the schedule that you chose to see it on.
Yeah.
Because like sure, you could have by that point I'm sure, I don't know if The Sopranos was up
and
for
DVDR
streaming
and stuff like that. But it was new.
Right. It was new streaming.
But immediately on demand, and not you have to watch it at Sunday at 8:00.
And Francis Underwood is, kind of the beginning of a decade of shows in which anti-heroes just got like worse and worse and worse. Perhaps bottoming out with Ozark, who knows? But these shows that seem to take an almost perverse interest in pushing the limits of how far a narrator can be bad and still be a hero. And most of the time, I don't think it's successful because they just, with the nature of episodic TV, you have to keep ratcheting up the tension somehow.
Yeah.
When you're writing, you have to make characters be plausible. And this character has put himself in, we talked about this last time, has really put himself in a pretty shitty situation right off the bat.
Yeah.
And Viet Nguyen does a marvelous job of doing difficult things to his main character. And I, just like you, wished he didn't kill Sonny. And the moment when he confessed that he was a communist, I was like, oh, where is this gonna go?
Right.
I saw this sort of like, okay, like,
ooh, this could be a whole nother book, right? This could be
a whole nother book.
Right.
This could go in a whole different direction. Is Sonny going to go back to Vietnam with him now? Like what? Because there's something when he sees Sonny is with Miss Maury, asks him like, why haven't you gone back? Like basically calling him a coward. And I think that when he hasn't painted himself into a corner, because I think he really knows what he wanted to do and he set out and did it. I also begin really losing my sympathy for the narrator at that point, because up until this point, he has kept his hands directly clean.
Yeah.
He hasn't actually done any of the killing. He's been like second or third degree for sure, but he hasn't, pulled the trigger.
Yeah.
And I think that's the reason why he does it so clumsily. I think that Nguyen wants to point out that he's pretty bad at this kind of wet work.
Yeah.
Which then, gets even more comical when he gets in country and is, like he's given a gun and people have to yell at him to shoot. And most of the time when he is shooting, he's just shooting blindly into the forest. And,
yeah.
But I think I get compassion for him back once we begin to experience just how bad the torture is and just how frustrating and pointless it is, which I think is the point.
Well,
I think that...
Yeah, and I mean, he's being tortured, and of course they don't care that he killed Sonny and the crapulent major, because that was on mission, more or less. I mean, even though Sonny, was a sympathizer, they, the communists who are torturing him have rationaled that sort of double agency to the point where, they don't care about that. What they're trying to get him to do basically is kind of renounce his selfness, to sort of pretend he's somebody he's not, which is like the one thing this guy can't do very effectively. Yeah. He can kind of do it for a bit, but he can't ever really lie to himself. And ultimately, he's too truthful. I mean, I think the other thing that also makes it feel very unsympathetic is that he confesses to being a communist. Sonny doesn't believe him, and he gets pissed, and that's kind of why he does it. But also, he kind of has a motive, because even though he's probably not in love with Miss Maury, he's jealous of Sonny, who is in love with Miss Maury. And so there's some part of him, he doesn't want to kill Sonny, but there's some part of him that kind of does, and that makes it extra bad, I think, too. Yeah,
he tries the entire book to retain some kind of moral, not superiority, but he tries to stay up above. And this is really one of those moments where he falls below.
Yeah. And
I think it's necessary, because like now he has to get out of the country. And so like he kind of has to go back to Vietnam. It's similar to what we talked about last time, is the way that structure and plot drive character and character development in this book. I think I can understand why Nguyen made that choice. I really I did have this moment of being like, where could this go if he doesn't kill Sonny?
Yeah. Well, and I think Nguyen does make it work, because I think even though I did probably the entire time feel, and I felt this way the first half too, that there's something about the combination of the character's voice, his moral ambivalence, and that makes the action feel like it's like on the other side of a glass pane a little bit. So I almost never felt like tension. And even when he's being tortured, I'm just kind of like, oh, this is very interesting what's happening to him. And unpleasant. It sure is unpleasant. And if there was a real person going through this, I would feel terrible for them. But I know that this is fiction. And so I don't know. And maybe it's something about the anti-hero quality. It's also something about the narrator's voice that I never really totally immerse in the story, even in the moments when I enjoy it the most. And I think probably when I enjoy it the most, it's the bouts of lyricism and also kind of the bouts of moral philosophy.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Yeah, and I think also the nature of the epistolary novel, I think, puts that kind of scrim between the reader and the experience. Because I feel that too.
Yeah.
Like I felt it more powerfully in The Sellout. We talked about that, where I was like, I just feel like there's something keeping me out of the immediacy of this action. And my next question there is about the switch in the POVs as we get towards the end of the book. As you pointed out, we get to plural first person. We get the royal we for several of the last few chapters. But chapter 21 shifts into just straight up third person.
Yeah.
We just shift out of first person. And the prisoner had never known that he needed a respite from history, he who had committed his adult life to its hot pursuit. His friend Man had introduced him to the science of history in the study group, its chosen books written in scarlet letters. If one understood history's laws, then one could control history's chronology, wresting it away from capitalism, already intent on monopolizing time. What do you think? Why this choice? We've been aggressively first person for 20 chapters, and this is a real change. Why do you think that he does this?
If I'm remembering correctly, this is after the confession.
Yep.
And then we learn, okay, he submitted the confession. It barely passes muster, and then he graduates into kind of like the oral exam, which is being tortured for several weeks, which is not, it's an indubious. And so, if I'm remembering correctly, I think part of the experience of being tortured, and we get this in sort of narration, is he essentially starts to hallucinate. He's most of there's not a lot of like pain in the torturing. It's mostly sleep deprivation. I think they do electrocute him a little bit, but it's not even that.
It's just to keep him awake. Basically.
Right?
Yeah.
So he's not. It's not like they're cutting fingers off or hot pokers or anything like that. But sleep deprivation is in fact torture. But eventually what happens is the brain just shuts down. And so he starts hallucinating. And part of that hallucination is he starts seeing himself. He starts having out-of-body experiences. And he starts having out-of-body experiences in the present, but also in the past. He also sort of sees into the moment of his conception. He has a vision of his father's sperm and the mother's ovum, encountering each other. And so I think part of what's happened, and now he's writing this addendum, he's writing kind of like the epilogue to the original confession. And I think it's revealing that he is in a state where he's looking back on the last few weeks, and because he was in a way driven out of his body. He was driven mad and driven out of his body, and he's looking back and kind of reconstituting that memory, and it seems like things that happened to another guy. He also talks about feeling sympathy for the man with two minds, which is him, and he's continuing to sympathize for the sympathizer, but he's standing outside of himself. And, that also gradually shifts back into first person, right? As he kind of like reassembles himself post-torture and has his final confrontation and goodbye with Man. So that was kind of my interpretation of that. And that it was very much in keeping kind of with the plot in some ways, and in keeping with where we thought the mental state of this character was supposed to be at this point.
Yeah, that's what I thought too. And I wanted to call attention to it because I really am so impressed in the ways that Nguyen uses literary device in ways that really seem to be the right choice. When you're this doesn't seem like, this isn't showy, this isn't put upon, it's sort of like the end of the chapter of Rob and Drew in A Visit from the Goon Squad, where that entire chapter is written in second person, and then right at the end we get this terrifying shift into first person as Rob is drowning. And And I was like, I was like the usual like slight dislocation of being of a point of view shift when you've been used to being in first person for a long time. And then I was like, this is fucking brilliant. And then you can really understand why then it shifts again into that first person plural as the narrator is different, but he never stops sympathizing.
Yeah.
Whether it's with himself or then with the world as it goes into we. But he is he's talking about himself, this man of two minds, but really he's not just talking about himself. He's talking about Vietnamese people. He's talking about anyone who's oppressed. He's talking about anybody who's a double agent. I mean, he's talking about anybody.
Yeah, and I think to your point, and maybe it'll transition into my first reading. As you were saying that I just realized like this is a man who knows exactly what tool to reach for and when.
Oh, yeah.
And at first I was imagining a golfer who always picked the exact right club, but it's more like a kind of like 19th century carpenter, because golf clubs all kind of look the same. They're long with a big, long and skinny with a big kind of whacker part at one end. Whereas like he's reaching for tools that are a lot, he's reaching for like a band saw or a keyhole saw, and then a draw knife, and then a wood chisel, and then a cornicing mortar, and then a block plane, and then a Japanese pole saw, they're different tools that do things, and he handles all of them with aplomb, and there's probably some that he handles better than others. But, there's some writers who have one or two strengths, and I like John Scalzi as a writer, really good at dialogue, really good at plotting, not really good at anything else. If you think about Andy Weir, like, again, also good at dialogue, good at plotting, good at humor, not really good at lyricism or poetics, except for maybe like one or two sentences, and particularly when he's imagining something spacey, as it not spaced out, but like in space.
Right, totally.
He can do some great visual. So I think another example of that is digression, flashback, and main plot all being woven together. So I'm going to read you, I think, my absolute favorite moment of that. And this is where the ambush has happened. Do we ever learn what mission they're on? Do we ever learn? I don't remember ever hearing like what they're doing.
What they're supposed to do. I know.
They're just like,
I mean,
it doesn't really matter, right? Like you kind of sense that it was fated to fail, but they're gonna incurse into Vietnam and sneak around, and I don't know what they think they're doing, or they're gonna meet up with somebody. But this is after the lieutenant. Is it the lieutenant whose leg is blown off?
The lieutenant is the one whose leg gets blown off.
Yeah, and so one of the Marines has handed the narrator the leg to carry. Yeah. And so this happens right after that, and they're essentially going to beat a retreat because they know that the enemy will have heard the mine go off and the screaming, and so they're like, we got to get out of here. Let's march for a few hours. So he's picked up the leg. It was only a hunk of meat and bone, its flesh sticky with blood and greedy with embedded dirt. When I took it and brushed off the ants, I found it a little heavier than my AK-47, the leg having been attached from a smallish man. The grizzled captain ordered us to march, and I followed the hefty gunner. Lieutenant's body slung over his shoulder. The lieutenant's shirt had ridden up his back, and the exposed plank of flesh was blue in the moonlight. I carried his leg with one hand, my other hand on the strap of the AK-47 hanging from my shoulder, and the burden of carrying a man's leg seemed far heavier than carrying a man's body. I carried his leg as far away from me as possible, its weight growing more and more like the Bible my father made me hold in front of the classroom as punishment for some transgression, my arm outstretched, with a book on the scale of my hand. I carry that memory still, along with the memory of my father in his coffin, corpse white as the affected lieutenant's protruding bone. The chanting of the congregation in the church too hummed in my ears. I had learned of my father's death when his deacon called me at police headquarters. "How did you get this phone number?" I said. It was in the father's papers on his desk. I looked at the document on my own desk, a classified investigation about an unremarkable event last year, 1968, when an American platoon had pacified a mostly abandoned village near Quang Hai. After executing the water buffaloes, pigs, and dogs, and after gang raping 4 girls, the soldiers had gathered them, as well as 15 elders, women, and children in the village square, where they fired on them until they were dead. According to a regretful private's testimony, the platoon leader's report certified that his men killed 19 Viet Cong, although they had recovered no weapons besides some spades, hoes, a crossbow, and a musket. I don't have time, I said. It would be important for you to go, said the deacon. Why would it be important? I said. After a long pause, the deacon said, you were important to him, and he was important to you. It was then I knew without any need for words that Deacon was aware of who my father was. We ended our forced march after 2 hours, the same amount of time devoted to my father's funeral mass. The creek gurgled in the arroyo where we stopped and where I scratched my face against the vine of bougainvillea. I sat down the leg as the Marines began digging a shallow grave. My hand was gummy with blood, and I knelt by the creek to wash it in the cold water.
Oh, man, the way he's able to move between time registers is just... He does it so effortlessly, which is nuts because it's not effortless. like doing that stuff and making the seams not stand out is just really, really hard. And yeah, he just is such a fucking good writer.
Yeah. The other thing about it too is that it's lyrical and it's kind of magical in the way that I think you get at least 3 time registers, right? Mm-hmm. Like if you think about it, there's now.
Yeah.
Where he's holding the arm.
He's put the leg down. Yeah. There's like, he's gets to where they're taking a break at the end of it. But yeah, there's now on the jungle. There's holding the Bible, which is 1 time register. Then there's several years after that, getting the call from the deacon. But then while getting the call from the deacon, he looks down at the desk and sees this report of an atrocity conducted, by the side that he's ostensibly on, but not really on. Yeah.
Then we're back to the funeral again. And no, sorry, we're not back. We were at the funeral briefly. So that's another time register. Then we're learning that the deacon knows that the pastor is his father, naturally, which is an incredibly important realization. And you have this, all of those things are happening, but you also have the sense of this guy walking and holding this arm the entire time, and his brain kind of just drifting through all of these things too. So it feels incredibly naturalistic, and we get all these naturalistic details like the color of the white and the color of the skin and the lieutenant's shirt riding up and the fact that there's already ants covering the bloody stump of the leg.
Yeah, he describes the bones sticking out as like a molar at one point, and the major is shot in the head at one point, and the it's described as the yolk of his brain kind of spilling out. Yeah. He's just really good. He's really good and really crafty. Like, he's not just lyrical. He has a real sense of how to put sentences together and a book together. Like, that just echo and echo and echo. I went back and reread the chapter 6 because I needed a little section of what Bond says at some point. And there's a sentence in chapter 6 where he's talking about nothing is more important than freedom and independence. And I was like, fuck, that was like 200 pages ago that he's setting those things.
The word nothing appears quite often in this novel. And there are a number of versions of I felt nothing was better. Yeah. And so when it becomes incredibly important, it's like some part of our brain has been permutated with that word. And also something, the word something is also, well, and you were making the point last time about Bond talking about needing to feel like he was somebody or something, because he was nobody and needing to do something in order to regain. So even those qualities are being, I do sort of feel though, like, I don't know, do you agree with this? Do you have the sense that like in the first half, those flights of fancy, like the character just sort of drifting and he's thinking about his dad or something. This moment to me felt like really masterfully constructed. Sometimes early on it felt a little bit more like, yeah, this is just kind of texture,
I think it's a book that will get better with rereading.
Yeah.
I mean, it's already good, but I think that it is one of those that upon a second read and third read, the textures of it will get more and more apparent. And I think
that might be. Yeah.
We talked about this, that like he could have gotten moving a little quicker in the first half. And we begin to see in the second half why he probably couldn't have gotten moving a little faster, because we do need some of those grounding details as part of his confession, but still like probably could have shaved like a chapter or two. And
yeah, it's hard. I mean, I definitely feel like the book would have benefited from starting more quickly, but I can see why that would be difficult given the number of things we need to know about this character, and what he kind of needs to see. I don't know. This would be an interesting experiment if I were to read it again. I do have the impression that the author got better at writing the book as he went along. And so even though it starts strong, it seems to me like, I think that happens with writers sometimes where like halfway through, two-thirds of the way through, your characters better, your sort of rhythms are established. And not that the writing in the first half is bad, but it to me, it sort of felt like these tangents and the sort of weaving between time signatures becomes a little bit more precise in the latter half of the book.
Yeah, and I think that as the stakes get higher and higher, this lyricism becomes more and more important. You can always, everybody always thinks that Shakespeare is all verse. And you're like, no, there's like huge sections of the plays where it's just straight up prose. Like it's not in rhythm, it's not in meter, it's nothing like that. But whenever something really big is happening, and this happens in opera as well, like it gets big, like you need to turn up your rhetoric. You can't, you like, it's very, and even if you're a writer like Hemingway, you still turn up the rhetoric, but it happens in a sort of denser way. You still feel that sort of gathering momentum of this is important. And I do think that as the stakes go up for this character, as the book goes on, those flights of fancy begin to feel more earned and more correct. And so maybe he could have curtailed some of that in the first half of the book, but maybe it's also him like setting up this character's, like really powerful intelligence, and ability, and also just how traumatized and messed up he is.
Yeah, and I think if I were to read it again, I would pay attention to that. That would be what I would be kind of looking for. And once you know where something is going, you start noticing things that you don't notice the first time because you don't have any referent for them. They don't resonate in the same way.
I've got a reading. Like you said, this episode could just be reading after reading. This is he is talking to Lana, the general's daughter, who has turned into like a torch singer and is sort of sexually liberated. And they haven't consummated their relationship yet. And it's right before the narrator is going to go off and kill Sonny. Her sincere shock endeared her to me. Underneath the nightclub makeup and artificial diva gloss, she was still innocent, so unsullied that all I wanted was to rub the emollient, creamy pulp of my ecstatic self onto her soft, white skin. I wanted to replicate the oldest dialectic of all with her, the thesis of Adam and the antithesis of Eve that led to the synthesis of us, the rotten apple of humanity, fallen so far from God's tree. Not that we were even as pure as our first parents. If Adam and Eve had debased God's knowledge, we had in turn debased Adam and Eve. So that what I really wanted was the steamy, hot, jungle dialectic of me Tarzan, you Jane. Were either of these couplings any better than a Vietnamese girl and a French priest? My mother used to tell me nothing was wrong with being the love child of such a pair. I told Lana. After all, Mama said, we are a people born from the mating of a dragon and a fairy. What could be stranger than that? But people looked down on me all the same, and I blamed my father. When I was growing up, I fantasized that one day he would stand before the congregation and say, here is my son that you may know him. Let him come before you, that you should recognize him and love him as I love him, or some such thing. I'd have been happy if he would just visit and eat with us and call me son in secret. But he never did. So I fantasized about a lightning bolt, a mad elephant, a fatal disease, an angel descending behind him at the pulpit and blowing a trumpet in his ear to call him back to his maker.
Yeah. It's just, he one of the things Viet Nguyen does really well is make the earthy and carnal poetic.
Yeah.
And so, wishing his father to die, essentially, and wanting to have sex with Lana, the general's and Madame's daughter, by the way, it's these are very earthy, normal, and not particularly noble thoughts, but they take on this kind of epic poetic quality, which is pleasurable, but it also, I don't know, there's a kind of dreaminess to the narrator too. Like it gives him this sort of, you realize that as like cynical as he is, he's also kind of deep down like really an idealist too, and actually, now that I think about it, one of the very last things he says as he's on the boat, in that kind of lyrical last passage, is he's still a revolutionary. He just hasn't found he's disenchanted with the communists. He was always disenchanted with the South Vietnamese and capitalism in the West. He's just looking for the right revolution, and he hasn't found it yet. And you get that same sense of, he wants his father to love him. He wants me Tarzan, you Jane. He wants sweaty sex with Lana, and gets it. It's one of the few good things that happened to him in this book. Or he alludes to it anyway. One sense is that they spent the night together.
You think they do.
Yeah.
But he just, this character is so, like what a perfect expression of, like, a disenchanted communist thinker. Everything is dialectical in this book.
Yeah.
He's dialectical. He's literally, like, he is literally a thesis and antithesis. Everything in here is about this doubling.
But no synthesis, except for maybe at the very end.
Yeah, you hope. I think that's the sort of happy ending of the book, is that it's sort of like the end of Train Spotting about deciding to choose life.
Yeah. No, you're right. He feels whole. He's been through a lot, and it's interesting. He has two brains and was driven half mad. Bon has one eye, and Man has no face, and they've all been permanently marked in this way. But of the three of them, only the narrator has really healed himself, or has been allowed to heal himself. Really, kind of in some ways because of the other two's sacrifice, unknowing or not. But in a way, both Bon and Man suffer so that the narrator can heal himself to some degree.
Yeah, it's really, like, the book is like a very amazing updating of Animal Farm. There's even a section where some character says, like, something about being slightly more equal than other characters, and I'm like, it's the pigs. Oh my god! Some pigs are just more equal than other pigs.
Some pigs are more equal than other pigs.
And it's just, the way, it's such a wild book because, like, most characters don't get names. I'm very intrigued by the characters that do. So Sonny gets a name, but even the name, like, even Sonny, like, that's also an epithet. Like, one of the characters, Man, you're like, okay, that's probably a name, but it's also like man. And then Bon, you're like, okay, well, like, good in French. And then, like, and then all of the unnamed characters in the squad. And so, like, the only characters that are named are basically, like, Lana, that has a name that doesn't really seem to mean something else.
And isn't that kind of an Americanized version of her Vietnamese? Isn't her
probably
name something like Lan or something like that?
Yeah.
But or Lang or something like that.
So it's another like stuffing together of things, and like this he's a communist, so like religion is the opiate of the masses. But here's his dad, who's a pastor, and like this whole section of like, here's my son that you may know him, let him come before you that you should recognize him. That's just like straight up like, I think New Testament stuff. Yeah. Like I think that's like in the Gospels. This when I listened to this and like listening to this chapter, like listening to this little passage, like it's not a stretch to say that like doubling is a very powerful theme of the book. But just like this passage, I really feel like boiled it down in such a powerful way. And that it gets to this moment of him really wanting to kill his father, which it turns out he tells Man that he wishes his father were dead, and Man obliges him.
Oh yeah, I had forgotten that.
Like towards the end, like Man's like, you knew what you were saying. Like you told me that you wanted him dead. And like there's a section where like the narrator's like, well, how did it happen? And Man's like, oh yeah, I just like sent somebody to your dad and shot him in the head.
Yeah. Well, nobody rid me of this meddlesome priest.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah.
You have a question I'm really interested in about the meaning of nothing, and I have a reading to react to that. So
great. Good.
Maybe that could be our last thing. Because I was really hoping we would talk about that.
Yeah, and I think it's really, I think, central. I mean, like it comes up so much. It's the climax of the book. And you already alluded to this earlier, and this is why I had to go back to chapter 6. But as the book ends, there's this real tension between something, nothing, action, and inaction. Like even on like a matrix, maybe. But like the thing that the nothing that the narrator eventually confesses to is that he doesn't take action when the communist agent is being raped.
He did nothing.
He did nothing. Yes, he did no thing. So there is this like very strange...
all that time he keeps saying, I didn't do anything. As in, I'm innocent. And they're like, no, you didn't do anything. As in, you're guilty.
And it's like, that's like just the wild nature of this book. And of like doublespeak, and when we're talking about communism, capitalism, and stuff like that, that like the exact same sentence can mean two completely antithetical things. Yeah. And it's why I'm so like excited about this book, is because like what an amazing way to take the kind of like dry and difficult ideas of like Marxist theory and dramatize them in a single character. And you're like, holy shit, that's incredible. And it gets summed up in another character in Bon in chapter 6, when Bon says, I'm not a man. And when a man isn't a man, he's nobody. And the only way not to be a nobody is to do something. And so there's this like brings in this question of like manhood, which we know the narrator talks about a lot, like hiding the tiny wrinkled purse that he carries around between his legs. So I don't even know if I have a question here. It's an observation about this something and nothing. And, and I think the thing that eventually frees the narrator is that what you talked about is like nothing is more important than freedom and independence, and the strange, like where nothing actually becomes a something.
And
like something is more important than freedom and independence.
Or freedom and independence in this context has been rendered less than nothing. Which I think, there's a lot of different meanings. There's also the nothing of oblivion, because one senses Man is suicidal. And so nothing can also mean nothingness or emptiness or death. I want to read you a quick reading from E.B. White from Charlotte's Web. This is when Wilbur apparently has been insulted by one of the other animals and referred to as less than nothing, to which he responds, "What do you mean, less than nothing? I don't think there is any such thing as less than nothing. Nothing is absolutely the limit of nothingness. It's the lowest you can go. It's the end of the line. How can something be less than nothing? If there were something that was less than nothing, then nothing would not be nothing. It would be something, even though it's just a very little bit of something. But if nothing is nothing, then nothing has nothing that is less than it is.
What a guy. What a guy, that E.B. White.
That's E.B. White. Now, here is Viet Thanh Nguyen. There was a number of moments where the narrator kind of explains the difference between nothing is more precious than independence and freedom, and nothing is also more precious than independence and freedom. This was my favorite explanation. And so he says, nothing is also more precious than independence and freedom. These two slogans are almost the same, but not quite. The first inspiring slogan was Ho Chi Minh's empty suit, which he no longer wore. How could he? He was dead. The second slogan was the tricky one, the joke. It was Uncle Ho's empty suit turned inside out, a sartorial sensation that only a man of two minds or a man with no face dare to wear. This odd suit suited me, for it was of a cutting-edge cut. Wearing this inside-out suit, my seams exposed in an unseemly way, I understood at last how our revolution had gone from being the vanguard of political change to the rearguard hoarding power. In this transformation, we were not unusual. Hadn't the French and Americans done exactly the same? Once revolutionaries themselves, they had become imperialist, colonizing and occupying our defiant little land, taking away our freedom in the name of saving us. Our revolution took considerably longer than theirs and was considerably bloodier, but we made up for lost time. When it came to learning the worst habits of our French masters and their American replacements, we quickly proved ourselves the best. We, too, could abuse grand ideals. Having liberated ourselves in the name of independence and freedom, I was so tired of saying these words. We then deprived our defeated brethren of the same. Besides a man with no face, only a man with two minds could get this joke about how a revolution fought for independence and freedom can make those things worth less than nothing.
Jesus Christ.
I want to give you one more reading. I know I'm laying it on kind of thick.
No, this is all I'm into it.
This is, you'll recognize this. This was a favorite passage of Ho Chi Minh, something he loved to quote. We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. That whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or abolish it and to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. One of the most elegant expressions of the Enlightenment's theory of the proper role of government, written by one of the greatest hypocrites, Thomas Jefferson, written by somebody who, just like the Commandant, just like the South Vietnamese, just like the French, just like the Americans, held and believed in radical revolutionary ideas about self-governance. And then once all of these entities got the power, they immediately take freedom from others and enforce suffering on other people. And it's so... I don't know if Viet Thanh Nguyen has read Thomas Jefferson, but like the connection to Ho Chi Minh, the Ho Chi Minh's quote and this observation that how quickly can you go from being a revolutionary to an oppressor? And I think there are a lot of meanings of nothing here, but this is the one that I found the most resonant, which is all of those things that the narrator does for the sake of an idealistic revolution that he truly believes in the end, become meaningless.
Yeah.
Because what do we have? We just have torture camps and a society where how does he get to America? He bribes the commandant from money that man extracts from the poor women who just want to visit their husbands and children in this camp. And this new communist government, I'll say quote unquote communist government, is every bit as corrupt as the colonialist governments and the colonialist sympathetic governments that came before it. And it's such a profound insight, and it's rendered so poetically.
Yeah, he does a great job of taking cliche like absolute power corrupts absolutely and dramatizing it in a way that it has impact. And like what's amazing about the Declaration of Independence is that it retains its impact after, 250 years. Like still listening to those words, you think, God damn it, why can't we pull that off?
And it's I mean, the same way that our narrator is bitterly disappointed by his side's inability to live up to their ideal. Think of how many people who have taken an oath to defend our Constitution, which was inspired by the Declaration of Independence, have then used their power to deprive other people of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness.
Yeah, it's a remarkable book.
Inspired by our friend Mac, I, for years, was in the habit of reading the Declaration of Independence on the 4th of July, wherever I happened to be. And I still do it sometimes, but I realize I have to be careful because many people see it as this patriotic gesture.
Or jingoistic, maybe.
Jingoistic. Well, it is patriotic, but it is patriotic the same way that the Vietnam War veterans who became anti-war protesters threw their medals at Congress. It's patriotic in the sense of I love this country and I want it to be what it says it's going to be, what it says it wants to be. I want it to live up to this actual ideal and not betray it. And so to me, reading that out loud was always an opportunity for us to reflect. Are we doing this?
In college, I took a Cold War American history class, and the normal teacher was on sabbatical. And my college, in like a stroke of genius, hired a North Korean professor to teach it to us.
Wow.
And it was amazing because it like just like you're talking about, and just like we've talked about in this book, it was just this like constant exposure of like, not hypocrisy, but doublespeak out of everybody. And it was really remarkable to have that particular perspective on, like something that we had all heard things in one particular way. And, and from his perspective, it was a very different story. And it was just wonderful. And I think
have you read Putin's speech on the eve of the Ukraine invasion?
No, I have not.
I mean, he's basically just like, who are you to tell us that we have to respect these international norms, United States and Great Britain? Who are you? I mean, and he's using that to justify a very evil and destructive act. But his analysis isn't entirely off. But I want to be very clear.
Yeah.
Putin is wrong.
Yeah, totally. Yeah. It's important to know that speech exists and to account for that and still be like, this is unacceptable.
And that also in this case, the United States is on the side of self-determination,
exactly.
And that is the correct side in this case, and
there's this great section in Politics in the English Language by George Orwell, where he's basically talking about prose. But the last line in a like series of like, do this, don't do this, do this, don't do that. The last one is break any of these rules before you say something truly barbaric. And I think that has like a place in this discussion and in this book, because like, you do need to be careful of going too far. and of saying something truly, truly awful, which in this case, Putin is.
Right.
Like he's like, you're like, no, this is not okay. Like, you cannot use these things as justifications of this like terrible thing that you're about to do. And I think that that's always a good thing to remember. And I think that nowhere in this book do we ever descend to a level of like barbarism. Like, it gets real close, you know, from the things that the narrator does. And certainly him killing Sonny is barbaric and unacceptable.
He never justifies it. Right. There's never, the closest thing you get to that is his evasion of not wanting to tell the story of the communist agent who was raped, which is a very understandable memory to not want to revisit too. I mean, it's horrific, you know, it is utterly horrific and painful to read. And, you know, I mean, they're making him confess that he didn't do anything to stop. What could he have done?
Yeah.
But I guess what I'm saying is the one quality our anti-hero narrator always has is he never lets himself off the hook for his immoral deeds. He allows you to understand his motivations, but he never claims, except for the squid rape a little bit. He does a little bit of, he points out that the squid are dead, and, you know, he kind of lets himself off the hook for that. But apart from that, he never pretends he's any more moral or less flawed than he is.
Yeah. And I think that's one of the reasons why he works as an anti-hero.
Yeah.
Like, he's conscious of his anti-ness.
Well, and it's also, he's an anti-hero in a world populated by anti-heroes. And,
that's true.
And his arc is just slightly redemptive. I mean, he doesn't really do anything good, but he survives. And, you know, one of the things that's also really, really well done is I never had trouble believing his friendship with Bond and Mann. I always bought it the entire time. And, you know, you just constantly stories of good friends whose political loyalties and sometimes even like military conflict loyalties divide them. That happens all the time. That's a very, very but then about 3/4 of the way through, you get their origin story, which just reinforces why these three guys, and they are going to incredibly extreme ends to look out for one another and protect each other. You know, Bond helps the narrator commit murder. The narrator goes back to Vietnam and goes on this mission that he has no place, you know, to try to protect Bond. And then Mann gets himself assigned to this hell on earth camp, you know, in order to try to protect both of them. And then, you know, and in the end, kind of sacrifices himself to not, I mean, arguably sacrifice. Certainly he does what he can. He does what he can so they can escape, and he stays behind, you know, holding the bag basically. And that part, when you hear the story, I mean, the way that they meet is that one of them's being bullied and the other two intervene, you know, and you're like, those guys would be friend for, you know, you do anything for somebody who did that, you know, when you're 11 or 12 and a bunch of kids are about to beat you up, and then this guy stands with you and gets beat up next to you. Like, that's a bond of loyalty that's never going to go away.
Yeah. Let's go to trivia.
Trivia.
Okay. I think I went first last time.
Oh, okay. All right. Well, Viet Thanh Nguyen tells a story about his childhood. His parents were some kind of retailers, and one of them, I think maybe it was both of them, or maybe it was just his father, was shot in a burglary. Not killed, fortunately, but injured. And he can remember it because he was watching a cartoon at the time, and the way he tells the story, he just didn't know how to emotionally relate to that, so he just wanted to keep watching the cartoon. And you know, probably in the way that some emotions are just too big for like a 9 or 10-year-old kid to process all at once. But he can kind of date it, and he knows how old he was because a Christmas program was on TV at the time. And was the thing he was watching that Snow Ghost Scooby-Doo which is kind of a pun. That snow ghost, or that snow ghost Scooby-Doo.
Oh gosh, that's no
B,
ghost.
the snowman. C, the Star Wars holiday special. Or D, a Ringworld Christmas.
Wow. So that's no ghost. The snowman.
Scooby-Doo.
That's no ghost. That's snow ghost. Scooby-Doo. The snowman and the Star Wars Christmas special.
Yeah.
Those are my real options. Okay. Oh God.
Are you sure Larry Niven did not write a Ringworld Christmas special for?
Oh my God, that'd be amazing.
It could have been like a Star Trek,
what are the aliens that have the
Pearson's puppeteer?
Yeah, that's what they're called. That's what
Yeah.
they're. Yeah, I can't remember the race name, but I've always. Yeah, they've
The
always,
brain is in the torso, and then
Yeah.
they have two heads that are also kind of like arms.
Yeah, and eyes. I think the eyes are also in the hands, which is wild.
Yeah, that's right.
Shit. This is just going to be a guess. I'm going to go with the Star Wars Christmas special.
No, I think it was that Snow Ghost Scooby-Doo. He calls it the Scooby-Doo Christmas special.
Mm-hmm.
And he said he was about 10 at the time. And so I looked up what Scooby-Doo Christmas special would have been when he was 10. And it was because they made, there were like 7 different Scooby-Doo series over the years, and each one made a Christmas special at some point. So I think the relevant one was from Scooby-Doo, Where Are You? Which was the original series. Which, by the way, do you know who does the voice for Shaggy in the original Scooby-Doo?
I don't.
Take a wild guess, like voice from the 70s.
It's from the 70s. Richard Pryor.
Equally weird, Casey Kasem.
Holy shit, what?
Shaggy is Casey Kasem.
That's wild. That is
and also kind of like the iconic stoner is sort of like, polo shirt wearing, like blackened shoe polish hair, Casey Kasem. I think that's incredible.
Wow, that's amazing. Yeah, I did not know that. Okay. In Hamlet, the word nothing comes up over 50 times. It is Shakespearean scholars have.
I was wondering if we were going to talk about Hamlet, and not merely the Hamlet,
not the Hamlet, which is so like it's like this book does
very clever allusion.
Yeah, it's so good. Yeah, it's great. But the word nothing shows up many times in the Elizabethan period. The primary double meaning of the word nothing was for A, noticing, noting, or perceiving. B, female genitalia. C, a class distinction used pejoratively to talk about lower classes.
I have this memory of Hamlet referring to Ophelia's lap. And that being a euphemism for female genitalia. But I could see why nothing would be a euphemism for female genitalia. And they certainly had a lot of them in those days. But, on theme, the first one is really, it seems logistically or linguistically possible. Nothing must come from no thing, but I could also see noting, and I could see perhaps they pronounce. Also, a TH was pronounced with a hard T in those days too. So I'm going to go with A.
Well, I clearly have my bullshit writing on correctly. You were right. It's B. You were right. The first part. It is female genitalia. And
always a good guess when we're doing Shakespeare.
Yeah, totally.
This word could be a reference to farting or male genitalia or female genitalia.
And
or
in this case,
same-sex relations.
Something is very often referred to male genitalia in this, and which I thought was particularly apt given all of the nothing and something and male genitalia that comes up in this book. But yeah, your memory is spot on. There's this scene where where Hamlet puts his head in Ophelia's lap. Lap is also, the word lap also means vagina. And so there's just a whole bunch of sexy stuff going on. And, Ophelia says, "I think of nothing, my lord." And Hamlet picks that up and runs with it. And it's definitely, he's basically like talking about genitals in front of the entire court. And yeah, it's supposed to be an uncomfortable moment in the same way that a lot of these moments in this book are uncomfortable. But
Hamlet has this kind of like drunk cousin quality, right? You're like, oh, just somebody take that guy outside and
take him to England and hang him. Get him out of here.
Call for Rosencrantz and Guildenstern. Yeah.
What could go wrong?
Get the college buddies to come and.
Those poor guys. Well, Dukes, are you going to read this book again?
God, I think I will. Yeah, I think I will. I think I don't know when, but I think it's so rich, and I think that even though for me on the entertainment scale, it's maybe 4 out of 5 in the sense of I still don't find it to be an amazing story, and I like a good story. The gifts that we've talked about, the lyrical writing, the way that the intellectual themes of the book derive naturally from the voice, musings, and plot of the writer are just so incredibly masterful that I think I will read this again. What about you?
Yeah, I'm same boat. I mean, so I listened to it primarily, and then I downloaded it to my phone, so I read it there. I really want to read a hard copy. I want to read it like I'm studying it. I want a pen. I want a notebook. I want to draw things. I want to make an index. Like I want to take it apart. Like I want to just learn as much as I can from it. Well, what's next?
Next is Milkman by Anna Burns from 2018, which was your suggestion and looks really, really good. But I'm really excited. Read it. Yeah, have you read it?
I haven't. No, I have not read it. I'm, we'll talk about this, my sour culture when we get to the end of all of it. But this was the book that made me be like, oh, that's what I'm going to call the series.
He uses the word sour a few times, but so did Paul Beatty. I noticed that too. And then, of course, with Milkman, one has the association of soured milk. So, I'm looking forward to talking about that too. I do want to know exactly where that came from, but so far on point.
Yeah, we'll see. I've gotten a little lucky, but I do think it's been apt. So, well, thanks for listening, everybody. Upper Middlebrow is a Small Point production. Chris Bagg and Jesse Dukes have 2 minds, no face, and 1 eye. Music by Ben Pajak and Jesse Dukes. Design and website by me, Chris Bagg. You can learn more about us and find our listener survey at uppermiddlebrow.com. And please review us in your podcast app so other people can find the show.
And a reminder, Chris and I are both writers and editors and can help you with your writing, podcasting, or editing project. You can see some of our portfolios and learn more at our respective websites, chrisbagg.com and jessedukes.com.